Hello, I'm Jonathan Gardner and I'm here to talk to you today about waste and urban heritage and specifically waste modified landscapes. So this is a session about urban infrastructures and urban resources. I want to explore the idea that waste material, like these dumped bricks here, is in itself a resource capable of producing and containing heritage. And not only that, but it's a material that allows the creation of whole new landscapes and imagining of new cities, new environments, and indeed new futures. So this would have had some pilot results by now, but circumstances have obviously intervened. So this is more of an introduction to my new research project, Reimagining British Waste Landscapes. And I'll talk about that project and where it's going next later on. So these are the kind of environments I'm talking about. These are some shale bings or spoil heaps in West Lothian from the oil shale mining industry, and these are now a protected natural heritage site. On the right you see a huge landfill site in New York City, fresh kilns, and again dumping of garbage can often create entire new topographic features and new uses. And again, this is a site that is becoming a nature reserve now. Other examples, this is fly ash from a former coal-fired power station which has been used to make lagoons for nature, again near Edinburgh in Scotland, which is where I live. And I think it's interesting in this case that the coal mines have gone, the coal-fired power station is gone. They obviously once fed the needs of the distant city, Edinburgh itself you see in the distance there, but all that is left is this ash and it's being put to an entirely new purpose. So sometimes the urban becomes rural and sometimes vice versa. On the right you see the Birkenkopf in Stuttgart, so that's a rubble hill made of bomb rubble in Germany, and there's lots of these there, and indeed in the UK there's smaller ones. But I include this because I think rubble produced from demolition or warfare is also a kind of industrial product of a fashion which has many uses and reuses for landscape alteration, and I'll come on to that. So most of these are kind of byproducts, as it were. I'm not necessarily talking about mining museums or the heritage of factories directly, but today I'm really focusing on the holes or the hills such industrial processes leave behind, the quarries, the dumps, the reclaimed land. As a whole category of something that creates new landscapes and indeed can create new heritage. So lots of others have obviously looked at the idea of industrial heritage in general, or waste and waste landscapes. Maybe famously people like Bill Rathje and Garbology in the US from the 1970s onwards, how consumers produce waste and what uses it gets put to. More recently, Mats Bergström wrote about a car cemetery in rural Sweden, which became valued for its scrap cars as a kind of heritage of nostalgia to some extent. And indeed, more recently, Caitlin De Silva has looked at the idea of entropy and the decay of heritage sites and industrial sites, and how this in itself can have a cultural heritage value. What I think I'm doing differently, though, is examining the idea of waste material and rubble, trash, being implicated in making a new landscape by addition or subtraction to the Earth's surface. And as I say, how these landscapes become valued as heritage or otherwise, or indeed how they are forgotten. So linked to this, I've kind of made a tentative typology of different types of heritage landscapes made through waste and industrialization. Firstly, those that are clearly recognized and valued as evidence of past industry. This could include intangible heritage too. As I say, I've talked about mining quite a lot, but it could also be things in a negative sense, so things like mining disasters. Sometimes the landscapes bear the scars of those disasters themselves, and become memorials to some extent. So the most obvious, as I say, is something like a spoil heap. It's very visible, it's recognized as such. It may be natural heritage, as the examples I mentioned earlier showed, but it can be cultural as well. And in natural heritage, in this sense, wildlife, greenery has occupied these spaces. The second type I'm interested in is not so much where the whole landscape is seen as heritage, but that it becomes it's a kind of matrix which contains things that we value from the past. So really quite archaeological traces. It could be architectural spolia, things that are considered trash or waste, but they are individually valued for what they represent. The material itself is of heritage value, but they are dumped in an otherwise kind of natural landscape. And I'll come back to that later on. Perhaps more complicatedly, the third category, and the one I focus on most in this talk, is where landscapes are made of waste material that facilitate, that was the matrix of material, but the third category, those landscapes which facilitate new activities not directly connected to the kind of production of waste or industry themselves. So in other words, how waste is used to do new things, so reclaiming land, or where waste heaps are turned into leisure facilities, so like a ski slope quite often happens with spoil heaps and rubble heaps. In both the second and this third type of categorization, waste is kind of incidental to some extent. It allows other things to happen. It is foundational for a new use or a new activity. It's a kind of sublation in a Hegelian sense. The waste is transformed dramatically into something else, something maybe more valuable, but yet it does retain something of its original self. It is recognizable if you dug deep enough, for example. And this extends to some interesting discussions around how waste can become heritage too, as we'll see. So these categories overlap, obviously, and it depends on who's valuing each site, who's visiting. But overall, I'm saying in each case, different types of waste have changed the landscape artificially. And in some cases, particularly the third category, created new opportunities for human and non-human activities, new spaces, new objects, and new activities that are sometimes considered heritage, or at least otherwise valued from a cultural perspective, or a natural perspective indeed. So I'm going to move to some case studies to illustrate some of these ideas, and given that we are at a London conference, these are mainly from East London. So first I want to talk about land reclamation, and specifically the reclamation of a place called Hackney Marsh. So this is Hackney Marsh up here, just north of the 2012 Olympic site, and this is UCL in the west where the conference would have been in person. So, in the Second World War, London was heavily bombed by the Luftwaffe, by the Nazi Air Force, and the city was short of places to put all the rubble from homes and factories that resulted. So one of the solutions that was used was the Lee Valley, so this stretch of land here with Hackney Marshes in the middle. And they decided, the authorities at the time, to fill in this marshy area with the bomb rubble. And they did this on purpose to improve the land, to make it change London using bomb rubble basically to create new uses and new opportunities for building and other activities. So in some places this bomb rubble is up to 3 meters. This place called Leighton Marsh, which is part of Hackney Marshes, you can see this ridge along here reclaimed entirely with bomb rubble, and indeed there's a bomb crater nearby on the LiDAR. There was so much bomb rubble, they needed to put it somewhere, but the idea was this was an improving process. It was a carefully designed process rather than a panic-filled activity. And it's interesting that actually a large part of where the Olympics were eventually built for London 2012 were also originally marshy lands, and they too were reclaimed with bomb rubble. So this just gives you an idea of the range of bomb sites just in the East End of London. This is our site up here, our marshes. So many of these buildings that were destroyed in the war or damaged badly, the rubble would have ended up in the valley of the river itself. After the war, what to do with all this open space? Well, one of the things that the local government did was to turn it not only into sites for new homes and new businesses, but for green space and sporting space. So 120 soccer pitches were built on Hackney Marshes, many of which remain today. And this also has taken on a life of its own to some extent. It became world famous as a place of grassroots football, which then fed into kind of the English pro football and indeed European football scene. And it's in that sense a kind of sporting heritage. It's well known. It's featured in different documentaries and music videos, adverts, that kind of thing, as a place of sporting heritage. And that continues today. So it's taken on a life of its own. These green spaces have other valuations, simply as places of picnicking or kite flying or whatever, just a nice green lung in the city. So when they're threatened, people often leap to their defense. So this is an interesting example. For the 2012 Olympics, Leighton Marsh itself received news that it was going to have this temporary basketball arena built on it as a training camp for the basketball players. And that eventually did go ahead, which is the building you see in this slide. What's interesting, though, is during the protests against this occupation of open public land, the rubble re-emerged, literally and figuratively, as a dangerous, threatening substance. Because it was rubble from the East End and from the factories during the war, there's a lot of heavy metals and asbestos within it, for example, and this was just dumped on the surface when the building was built. So the rubble proves kind of two-faced here. As a raw material, it was positive. It raised up the ground from the marsh. It allowed green spaces for picnicking or for footballing. But when it was re-excavated, when it was unearthed, it was negative and still literally toxic. And I think also imbued with some of that negativity, obviously, of the destruction of the war. So an interesting case there, and one that I want to look into further. So I'll move to another East London example. We're going skiing, not those Alps, but these Alps, the Beckton Alps in East London, and a massive artificial hill. This is what it looks like today, the Beckton Alp. It's the last one. There used to be several of these artificial hills. And basically these were created from coal waste from Beckton gasworks. And here they would have heated up this coal to make coal gas, or town gas as it was called, from 1870 until 1976. This is one of the largest coal gas and coke plants in the world. And this is what we used for heating and lighting in the UK and elsewhere until the development of natural gas, methane from things like North Sea gas. So this substance is very useful, not only for the gas for lighting and heating, but also for byproducts like ammonia, useful in dyes and chemicals and so forth, but it also left a kind of toxic legacy. So this is what the Alps in their full extent looked like in the 1970s, for example. This isn't the only history, though. This is still recognised as the highest artificial hill in London today. It's 36 metres above sea level at the top, and it's also a protected scientific site for nature, and rare species of plants and birds live there. Interestingly, it had its own artificial ski slope built here as part of a regeneration project in the 1980s, and this was opened no less by a celebrity by Princess Diana, herself. So I wish I could show you some pictures of a rather strange opening day, but I don't have the copyright, but you can Google it. And this was part of a much wider urban regeneration of the Docklands area and this part of East London, which at the time was seen to be very successful, as the Docklands Development Corporation statement on the screen says there. The idea that this former industrial land was regenerated because they built a ski slope on a toxic slag heap. This didn't last very long, the success. As you can see it today, it's now derelict once again. This is partly because the toxic waste started to escape from the hill, and it is now sealed off, and you're not meant to access it anymore. In theory, there's numerous plans afoot to transform it once again. Some people want to conserve it as the Alp, other people just want to destroy it. So it's a kind of contested heritage of regeneration and re-regeneration, if you like. The wider gasworks itself has many popular culture associations, most famously in its ruins, having featured in Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, and in various music videos and art projects and so forth. So it's an interesting case study. It's valued both for natural heritage, as this kind of curious story of a ski slope and regeneration. Its threat of removal has sparked kind of fierce debate as well. So I'm interested in tracking down in the next stage of the project all these different uses and opinions, and to see how waste becomes transformed into culturally valued activities or leisure activities, and indeed as heritage. So drawing to a close, really, it's worth pointing out that there's other examples of such phenomena in other countries. So this is an Estonian shale oil mountain And again, the slag has created artificial ski slopes and natural green spaces. Very briefly, just at the end, I think there's also these kind of categories that are in between. So neither a kind of waste landscape recognised for industrial heritage or indeed for the new uses that can be done on them. So this is Wembley Stadium, the old Wembley Stadium in London, which was demolished in the mid-2000s. But what a lot of people don't know is that the stadium is not totally gone. It just kind of moved to the outskirts of London in a different sublated form. So this is Northala Hills, a huge land art project, and it's entirely made of the rubble of that stadium. Some people think they look like kind of Neolithic mounds, and I certainly agree with that. And they also have associations with the medieval name of the area, Northala. There's other remnants of the stadium elsewhere. This is just one fragment, so maybe more like that second category of waste landscape I was talking about. This is the part of the flagpole of the stadium in a North London park. So I think it's interesting, these categories. Is it Northala Hills? Is it the stadium? Is it both? I'm really not quite sure myself. So these are the kind of final aims of the project as we'll go forward. How people value this stuff is something I'm really interested in. How does waste become valued as heritage, basically? And that will begin, as I say, in October 2020. And I'm looking forward to seeing particularly how, through interviews and ethnography, what people think of these landscapes, those that live and work on them in particular. So I think I'll leave it there because I'm running out of time. But if you have any questions, please get in touch in the Q&A. Thank you.